In my former career as a social worker in a special education school, on any given day, at any given moment, quite honestly, practically anything could happen. There was a child who, on the day that he came just to tour the school to see whether or not this would be the place for his education, he decided now would be a good time to flush all of his clothes down the toilet. That's right, all of his clothes. Then, of course, there was the youngster who I had in my office, who I knew when we had a fire drill I'd better hold onto his hand because there's no telling where he could go. And as we made the way out of the building, there was a ramp out of the building, so his arm is all the way down there, and I'm still up the ramp, and he's looking back up and he says, "Hey, you're a lot taller outside." And then in later years, the administration that had come in at that time decided what we really needed on the day before students arrived was a team building day. And for 2 years running, the team building day included a scavenger hunt where one of the items was to find something shaped red. Exactly. So the first year I protested, and the second year I was like, really? Anything could happen at that job. Among the students, there were fist fights, furniture thrown from one side of the room to the other, and full-blown restraints that had to be enacted when a child or an adolescent were unsafe to control themselves at that moment. So for any of you debating if you want to become a deacon or an elder, none of that happens at meetings. But as wild as all of those stories seem, they all really happened. And through it all, I managed to keep my sanity, or what was left of it, by having a core group of people that thought at least somewhat like I did and shared my sense of humor. And the fact that for all that was going on and all the unpredictability, I knew that I had my role, I had my place, and I also had my office where I could go and do what I knew I was supposed to be doing. And I like to think that I did it pretty well. There was a staff who was there throughout at least the first half of my 21 years there. Joan's role was very different. She was certified to teach special education, but for most of those years, she wasn't assigned full-time to a classroom. On the staff list of phone numbers, Joan was listed as our certified substitute, our floater, if you will. On any given day, Joan would arrive at 8 a.m. with the rest of us, and only upon arrival would she find out who she was going to be that day. If a teacher were absent, Joan stepped in to teach the class. If one of the teaching assistants were absent, Joan stepped in to be an aide in that classroom. If there were class trips, Joan would often be behind the wheel of the 15-passenger van, and we'd hope at the end of the day back at the school there would be 15 passengers. If the principal had some new special project, Joan became her right-hand woman to do the steps that needed to happen. At some point I sat down with Joan and I told her how much I appreciated and respected what she did, because I knew I wasn't cut out to do that. For all of the seemingly lack of boundaries in even my own role, I knew my place, and I knew when I arrived at 8 a.m., I knew who I was and what I was expected to do. For Joan, every day was out of the ordinary. And this idea of ordinary and out of the ordinary occurred to me as I read today's gospel from Matthew. We call this our third Sunday after Epiphany, and some other traditions say that we are in ordinary time. Perhaps we only need to look briefly at the news to question, are we really in ordinary time? But ordinary time means counting of weeks, more than it means anything usual or dull. But this is a time we're not in Advent or Christmas, we're not in Lent or Easter. We're in this in-between time. And in a way, where Matthew places our events for today is sort of an in-between time for Jesus as well. The baptism and temptation are on one side. His inaugural address, the Sermon on the Mount, is on the other. And Jesus is here in this time between. And we're told he's beginning to select those who will join him in his ministry. So this time for Jesus, this in-between time, is anything but ordinary. What I read started off with hearing that John the Baptist has been arrested. Literally translated, he's been handed over. The same language that we'll hear about Jesus himself in Holy Week, when he's been handed over. And John hasn't been arrested because he's been baptizing. John's been arrested because he dared to be the voice, the ethical voice, at that moment in time, speaking truth to power that didn't want to be questioned. John had basically publicly indicted Herod because Herod stole Herod's brother's wife, violating the law and the culture and all that went with it. And rather than face the disgrace of his arrogance, Herod decided to silence his critic. So that's all the stuff that's in that very first verse that I read. And then this withdrawal of Jesus, moving from one spot a little further north, wasn't taking flight out of fear, but a bold strategic move on the part of Jesus. Not the sign of a coward, it's the sign that Jesus was not going to retaliate against Herod with aggression, but was going to start his ministry in earnest. Think of what Jesus had to do. For his ministry to really begin, he had to move away from his hometown, from his family, from all that he knew. Jesus had to step out of the ordinary to get to Capernaum. He moved from the area where chances are people talk the same and maybe look the same and worship the same. And he goes and settles in a more diverse area. Capernaum and Galilee were among the first of the areas to be sent into exile. That's what Billy was reading from Isaiah. And they were the first people then to be restored to the land when the exile was over. And in all of that, what you had in that area of Capernaum was a diversity. There were Jews and there were Gentiles. There were cultures and beliefs in conversation with one another. And in that same area, Capernaum was a land of rich, fertile soil that could actually grow food to sustain them. So you put all this together, and Capernaum was a happening place. Capernaum gave Jesus a bigger audience than he would have had back home. And it would have given him the freedom to preach and speak more openly than in an area that was the center home base of the Pharisees. Doing something new, being in a new place means doing something out of the ordinary, out of our comfort zones. And it's here where the Gospel of Matthew tells us Jesus first preached and first proclaimed with the sure and certain conviction of his authority. Spoken another way, we can imagine the meaning of what Jesus says. Whatever you've been doing, step out of the ordinary. Change your direction. Change your orientation. Reorient yourself in some new way. The active presence of God is happening here and now, and it expects your participation. The first ones that we're told that Jesus speaks and encounters, they're doing quite the ordinary. These brothers, Simon and Andrew, were in the middle of their daily routine. They were fishermen casting their nets, ordinary workers doing their ordinary jobs. This gospel doesn't give us any miracle sign that they suddenly were told by Jesus and pulled in a gajillion fish. They were just casting out their nets. Jesus would take what they know how to do and have them do a new thing with it. And next we're told he finds another couple of brothers, James and John, perhaps from a rival fishing company on the same lake. And Jesus calls them from mending their nets. And James and John drop everything, including dear old dad, Zeb, in response to Jesus. All of this would have been so out of the ordinary, because in those days and those times, the rabbi would have stayed in place and waited for prospective students to come and seek the rabbi out. Instead, Jesus flips what would have been expected, and he goes and does something out of the ordinary. Jesus, the teacher, goes out and seeks the student. I mean, even just think about it in our own life and times. When students are considering schools, they apply to the school. When we're looking for work, we apply to a job. Even if we have a rare and unique talent, maybe it happens in another way. But I suspect the Yankees are not going to offer me a 9-year contract for $324 million to be the team chaplain. What Jesus did was out of the ordinary. He did what was foundational to our theology. He initiated something, and these 4 fishermen responded. They followed. They stepped out of the ordinary of what they do into something seemingly wholly uncertain. They didn't know precisely what would happen next, yet we're told they followed. They followed this Jesus wherever he went. More than once, in different sources that I read about this passage this week, I came across this phrase: the disciples exhibited radical obedience to the irresistible authority of Jesus. And Jesus then went to gatherings of people. Matthew calls them the synagogues. Not necessarily like a church building, but gatherings of people. Faithful seekers, wandering worshipers who were craving something out of the ordinary in their lives, looking for the meaning of life in a life of meaning. Jesus came to teach, to break out of the ordinary, to break out of the ordinary notions of who God is, inspiring wonder with this good news of God alive, loving, and at work within, between, and among. Those very first disciples, they knew their way around a boat. They knew how to catch fish. They knew enough of that, presumably, to do it well enough to sustain their families. I don't know a lot about fishing, but I imagine that to do it, they possess some combination of patience, courage, and commitment. Jesus saw something in them that maybe they didn't see in themselves. How they could apply these ordinary skills to do wonderful things along with Jesus. Soon after worship today, we're going to have our annual congregational meeting next door. Like Simon, Andrew, James, and John, we're called to an adventure. For all of our planning, for all of the numbers crunching and projections, none of us has that crystal ball to know precisely what is going to happen between now and the next time we get a year in review. But we are called to step with faith into this new thing that God calls us to do. God initiates, we respond. What fish have we been catching? What nets have we been mending? Reflect on what it is we know how to do, and step out of the ordinary to participate, to partner with God where God calls us. Jesus taught, proclaimed, and cured. Let us step out of the ordinariness to be shown where God wants us to gather, to restore, to heal in a world that so desperately needs to know of God's love.